as the kids are heading out, I just want to say thank you, Stephanie, for sharing your heart. That's really cool. And one thing here at Forward City Church is that we love when people step out and do things. Because one of the things that we really love about this is that we love when people have personal ministry, when people step out on their own and find things that the Lord would have them to do and reach in our community. Because the hard part is that it seems so big, and it's so big, and we talked to Stephanie about this before. The need is huge in our community, and there's so many different needs, and there's what about this and what about that, and it can get so overwhelming, and sometimes it's so overwhelming that we just don't do anything at all because we can't do it all. So what we like to remind everybody is that just help one the way you wish you could help them all. You can't help everybody, but you can help one the way you wish you could help them all. And so over the course of our past and as we move into the future, we want to continue to help us as Forward City Church to move into the lives with the gospel of Jesus Christ. There are three things that we value here. I mean, we value many, many things, but there's three things that we really lean into here at Forward City, and one of them is a gathering. We want to gather together and celebrate the Lord together and worship Him and come and live our lives in such a way that just brings people to Jesus. We want you to be connected to a family, a smaller part of the family within the larger family, within a life group, because we believe it's there that you get the help and you get the encouragement, the growth and discipleship, and it's where you just you build relationships and you learn better within circles rather than rows. So we really move people into a life group because that's what you're cared for. And then finally, we like to see people live out their faith in a personal way. So it's not just being fed by other people, but where you are walking with the Lord on your own and in community, but then you're using the gifts of God to impact a community that desperately needs Jesus. So we want that to happen for you. Anyway, so thank you again, Stephanie. And I know many of you others serve in other places, but if you're looking for a place, that's a pretty sweet place to do it. It's hard, absolutely, but man, is it so worth it. And so speaking of difficult and speaking of worth it is what we're going to talk about today. If you're new with us, if this is your first time here, your first time in a long time, my name is Mark, and I am on the leadership team here at Forward City Church. I'm part of the team of people that helps us all move forward towards a full life in Christ. And if you've been new with us, you're coming in the last part of a series of messages that we've been kind of working through on this thing called margin. We've been talking about it, and if you're new and you haven't caught the rest of the series, you're welcome to go online and listen to it or watch it or whatever to kind of catch up where we've been. Because basically the first couple of weeks, the first week we really just talked about, we did more of an introduction to it, just, an understanding that our margin, when we have margin in our lives, it allows us to have really real time with God. And we talked about 2 weeks ago, is that when we build margin into our finances, we talked about that. And then finally, last week we talked about margin in our schedules, which for me was probably one of the most difficult ones that I've had to speak on, because that's the area that I struggle with probably the most. What we've learned together is that margin is what we have that's unallocated. As if we're going to kind of put a definition to margin, margin is what we have that's unallocated. It's the difference between what you have and what you need. It's the extra, it's the breathing room, it's the space that allows you to do the things possibly that God asked you to do. It's the space that allows you to be stressed with not being stressed out because you have margin emotionally. It's having space to listen to God. It's having that time where you can set aside and you can say, you know what, no, this is a God time, because we're always running around and we miss that beautiful privilege to be able to do. It's the money left over to be generous. Rather than spending to the end, we save something so we can be generous and give to other people. It's the ability to pivot, as we talked about last week. It's the ability to pivot into something more important, possibly, without being overwhelmed because you don't have any space in your schedule. So we've been talking about margin, and today we're going to talk about margin in a different way. We're gonna go back into 1 Corinthians. We kind of took a deviation from 1 Corinthians, kind of our study through the book of the letter to the Church of Corinth. But we're gonna kind of merge back into there, because what we're gonna talk about today is really spoken about very clearly in a chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians. So if you have your Bible, you can turn there. And what you're going to see is that we are going to talk about margin morally. We're going to talk about building moral margin in our lives, especially as it relates to like sexual sin. Now, aren't you glad you came today? Yes. Thank you. Now, to begin with, we just want to state the obvious here. We all have limits when it comes to margins. We all have moral limits. We all have our own limits. Some of those are self-imposed limits that we've kind of put on ourselves over years in the past. We've kind of sat down and we said, okay, I don't maybe know where it came from. This is where I'm going to go. I'm not going to go any further. This is my limit. This is my stopping point. This is this far and no more kind of a thing. I'm not going to look at that. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do that. And it's kind of self-imposed. Maybe you don't know where it came from. Maybe it's a family thing. But, hey, this is where I'm landing here. You have some of you have spiritual imposed limits where you just, kind of feel like, oh, I believe the Bible is true. I believe the Bible is something for me to listen to and to walk with. So, and this is kind of where the Bible says. So, I'm going to kind of lead into that. So we have those limits that way. There's legal limits. We all have there are legal limits. There are things that legally you can and you can't do. There are legal things that you can get involved in and legal things that you cannot get involved in. If you do that, you're going to get arrested and potentially go to jail. See, the thing is about limits is you don't have to be a Christ follower to have limits. You don't. You don't have to be a Christ follower. I would say, I would even venture to say even the most, anybody on any spectrum would say, if you kind of press it down, they would say, yes, no, this is a limit. Now, their limit may be different than yours or different than mine, but they would have a limit. They would have a space where they say, you know what? No, you can't do this. Everyone has a limit. If we're pushed far enough, it's this far and no more. See, the question is that we have to ask ourselves is not are there limits? But the question that we need to ask ourselves is, will we adopt the standards of our culture, the standards that our culture pushes us to, or will we step back from the line and create margin in our lives morally and allow ourselves to be limited by the limits that God leads us to? Because see, we have a choice, right? We have a choice. The culture is really leading us in a particular space. And so the question is that we need to ask ourselves, there is not is there limits morally? But the question is, where are those limits? And where should they be? See, now I realize that today, out of all of the things that we've talked about, I'm going to get the most pushback. I understand that. This is probably going to be the time when some of you are going to have some questions. And I know I'm going to get some questions online. I'm going to get some questions through text and email. And I love the fact that you are going to ask questions. I love the fact that we're going to wrestle with this together. And I love the fact that this isn't like we're judging each other, because honestly, I wish someone told me this back when I was younger. So I understand there's going to be a little tension here. But that's good. Right? Because we're a family. Family, we allow a little bit of tension. We welcome conversation. We welcome pushback. We welcome, hey man, I don't know about this, or what do you think about this, or let's talk about this. We welcome those things because that's what family does. Family talks about stuff. I don't want you to leave anything we ever say and say, well, Mark said it, so therefore it's true. Now, obviously, my wife doesn't even think that. We don't want you to do that. We want you to wrestle with this. And we know that some things we're going to wrestle with together, and some things we're going to walk away from. Okay, I don't know about Mark. He's a little out there. I get it. But this is super important. Some of the stuff we're going to say today, you're going to say, well, man, Mark, you were so incredibly out of touch. Or Mark, what you're saying here is so incredibly impractical, it's impossible. How can any person do that? And I get it. So let's talk. If we offend, let's have conversations, because here's what I'm convinced of. Here's what I'm absolutely convinced of. But that if we build margin in this area of our lives, it will have a profound benefit in your life, in your relationships, in your future relationships, in your marriage, in your dating, with your kids, and also with yourself. And if it's not applied, it's not the same for every person. Doesn't mean it's going to happen to you, but if not applied, you have a very, very good probability that it could lead to hurt and baggage. So now I also realize that there's some younger ears here, so I'm going to honor some of those younger ears. But honestly, I can't think of a better topic to be able to share with teenagers in an appropriate and a thoughtful way. So anyway, here we go. We're going to rock in this. Now, because our culture we need, especially young kids need to hear this kind of thing in an appropriate, in an age-appropriate way. I fully understand that. Because we live in a culture that is way overly sexualized. We live in a culture that tells us to go as far as you can, to go as far as you go. Look at what you want. Do what you want. Go as far as you want morally. To our teens, our culture makes everything out. It markets everything with a sexual hook. If you don't believe me, just stop and take a look. And to those that are single in our culture, it says, we don't want you, if you're single, we don't want you to miss out. We don't want to miss out on any opportunity, any experience. Do whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want, in any context you want. To those that are married, culture says forever is a great idea, but it's impractical. Culture says that if she stops or if he doesn't, then just drop him and go find someone else. To all of us, it's saying that it's not wrong. It's you do what you want, whenever you want. Look at whatever you want. Because honestly, looking never hurt anyone. See, what culture doesn't tell us, what culture doesn't tell you, and what culture doesn't tell me is that when you cross that line, culture says, right, go as far as you want, go right up to that line, go right up to that line. But what culture doesn't tell you is that when you cross that line, there's consequences. Now, not all consequences are the same. We get that. There's a lot of things that we've talked about over the last couple of weeks that have consequences. We know that. But some of those consequences, if you go over the edge financially, okay, yeah, there's some consequences. If you go over the edge, with your time, there's going to be some consequences, absolutely. But if you live right on the edge morally, one bad mistake, one lapse of judgment, one stressful moment, one moment of letting your guard down, the consequences can be a lot bigger, and in some cases, you pay for those consequences the rest of your life. Not in every situation, maybe not in yours. And sadly, I think you and I have all known people who have wrecked their lives, or at least damaged their lives, or at least put some real issues into their story because they stepped over the line sexually. Maybe some of you, some of you here. I don't know. Some of you online, maybe someone who, maybe none of us, but we struggle with pornography, and it's like I never really thought this was going to be an issue. Just look at a couple things, and then it's become a full-blown thing, and it's to the point where these images continue to overtake your life, and you just can't say no, and you just can't stop. Maybe some of you with some past choices, you've brought the baggage of those things into your current relationship or your current marriage, and you know the tension that those pasts have brought. The tensions of comparing expectations. Well, he did, she, all this, and this is what it was, and this is what it's supposed to be like, and the fear and the insecurity that some of those things can bring into your new relationships in your marriage, and you've seen those things. And what I've noticed of all my years being a pastor, working with people, the most common thing I hear people say to me on some side or another of this, they say, I never thought it would happen to me. Almost every single person that I've walked through this with before, they've almost all to a person said, I never thought this would happen to me. And we see that same common theme through the people in our lives and the people that we're connected to. And you may be saying, well, what do you mean by moral margin? In this context, I call it putting distance between you and temptation. So we're talking about building moral margin. What does that mean? So we're being tempted on so many different levels in so many different ways. What it really, moral margin means putting some distance between you and temptation, putting a bit of a buffer zone between you and the temptation that's going to be inevitably coming in your direction. And because your heavenly Father loves you so incredibly much, he wants you to have moral margin. He wants you to have space between you and temptation, not because he wants to stop you from having fun. Not because he wants you, to kind of conform to a particular image, or he wants you to miss out. No, it's because he loves you so much. He knows that if you cross that line, there is an incredible potential for destruction in the end. See, he says, I love you so incredibly much. I know what's on the other end of that line, because here's the reality is we don't always see what's on the other end. We see what we can do, but we typically struggle with what happens when we do. Because a lot of times the consequences of our actions aren't known until the action's already done. Because he knows that when you cross that line, it can cost you, some of us, for the rest of our lives. It's not unrepairable. It's not unforgivable. There are, yes, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's not that. He's just saying that I know the scars, man. I know the memories. I know the baggage. I know the addictions that often will come when you cross that line morally. Because when you do, you have a potential of losing what you love the most. So the Bible, the Apostle Paul speaking to the church of Corinth, they had a lot of struggle with this. They, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, it says this: flee from sexual immorality. Simple, right? Flee from sexual immorality. Now, that word flee there is within the Greek word, so we all know, if you don't know this, the Bible wasn't written in English. The Bible was written in Greek and Aramaic and other languages, and so it was translated for us. And the translators here, we have a few words, whereas the language it was written in has many, many words, and so we're trying to figure out the best words possible. And the word translated here is flee, right? In the Greek word for that is this word fugo. Sounds like a really, really cheap card, doesn't it, Tim, right? Fugo, right? So fugo, right? My friend had a Yugo. That was a horrible card. This is not the same thing, but it's similar. The word fugo here means to flee. It means to run. It means to get out of there. It means to put distance between yourself and this. And so he's using in this particular context, he says, fugo from sexual immorality. He goes, run away from it, get away from it, put distance between you and sexual immorality. Notice it doesn't say flirt with it. And as a teenager, man, that's what we did, right? You flirt with sexual immorality. You flirt with it. He says, no, don't flirt. This isn't see how close you can get to it without getting burnt. This isn't see how close you can get to before you go over the edge. He says, I want you to put significant margin. I want to put significant distance between you and that temptation. Because if you don't, it has the potential of grabbing onto you and bringing you over the edge. In other words, what he's saying here is as soon as you see that temptation coming, you get out of town. You put some distance in there. You put some margin in there. You between you and temptation. Run, Forrest, run. Sorry, that's a reference of a movie a long time ago for those of you who are too young. What does he mean? See, culture says live on the edge. Don't worry. What really can happen? God says, man, I love you so much. I love you so much that I don't want you to make a mistake. I don't want you to step over the line. I don't want you to have that lapse, because living on the edge sets you up for disaster. And so some questions that we can ask here. And we ask the question is, well, why does the Apostle Paul zero in on just kind of one thing here? Why is he saying, why is he zeroing in and saying, okay, flee from sexual temptation when there's all kinds of other temptations, there's all kinds of other sins that are out there, there's so many other things. Why is he zeroing in on this? And the rest of the verse says this. It says, all other sins a man or woman commits are outside the body. But he who sins, or he or she who sins sexually, sins against their own or his or her own body. And see, notice here, so the Apostle Paul is doing something very interesting here. What he's doing is he's putting sins in categories. See, he's saying that sexual sin in some ways has a category all of its own, that there's something unique about this that's a little different than the other sins out there. And I know what you're going to say, because the same thing I say when I read this is like, but I thought all sins were equally the same in front of God, which is true. All sin is against God. All sin separates us from God. All sin needs to be forgiven. All sins have been forgiven. We have the ability to be forgiven on the cross of Jesus Christ. He died for all sins. Absolutely. There isn't a sin that gets you closer to God, or gets you further away from God than another. No, that's not the case. All sin is sin in God's eyes. But what he's saying here is in our earthly life, in our context, some things have a greater consequence than others. See, there's just a greater consequence that accompanies sexual sin that other sins don't have there. Now, other sins have major consequences. We get it. I mean, if you tell a white lie, it doesn't cost you anything, probably. If you speed, you go 10K over the speed limit, well, for the most part, what are you going to get? A fine? Okay, you can maybe get some points taken away. I get it. If you gossip a lot, you're going to lose some friends and you're going to lose some relationships, absolutely. But if you sin sexually, you have the potential that your kids could grow up without a mom or dad in the home. We've seen it. You sin sexually, you could lose your self-esteem and lose your reputation. If you sin sexually, you have the potential to lose your job and even your marriage. And it can cost you things that matter to you probably for the rest of your life, or at least adds tension and hurt and baggage that you continue to bring to the next relationship, and on and on and on. And the Apostle Paul says, all other sins, they're outside the body. They're still sin. And they still can be completely and utterly and beautifully forgiven by God. A lot of people look at this, will say, well, because I've done things in my past or whatever, so therefore Mark's saying that God can't forgive me. I am not saying that, because I've lived this. And I've understood the forgiveness of God even through things like this in my life. But he's right. I have baggage. He's right. There were things that I brought into my marriage that took a while to change, to get out. See, there's people who sin outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. And honestly, I wish that the Apostle Paul gave us a little bit more understanding here. I wish he kind of dug deep and explained this a little bit more, but he really didn't do it that way. But even without that teaching, you and I both, we all know together, and we've observed this and we've experienced this, and this is the things that I've experienced over the course of my years as a pastor, which hasn't been that long, but I've seen it, that this sin is different. It runs deeper than you think. It sticks with you. It's painful, it's emotional, and it's deeply spiritual. And one of the reasons why I know this is through personal experience. See, the man or woman who sins sexually, they carry with them scars, they carry with them memories that they can carry with them for the rest of their lives. And if it happens over a longer period of time, it affects their future relationships. And in many cases, it takes years and years to overcome that. It takes years and years to overcome the habits and the patterns and that are associated with our past. So our Heavenly Father, who loves you so incredibly much, allowed this to be in the Bible, not to shame a church in Corinth, but to show them and to show us that there is another way. And he's saying here is because don't flirt with it. Because here's the problem. It's exciting. It fills something in us. There's something that we want to, that draws us to it. God's like, man, I love you so much. Don't flirt with it. Don't get as close as you can to it. I spent many years as a youth pastor, and I had so many teens ask me the same question that I asked other people in my life, is how far is far enough? How far is too far? And the Apostle Paul saying, no, that's the wrong question. You got to run from it, not get as close as you can to it. Family, we need to stop letting our culture set our limits. You need margin, you need distance between you and temptation. Yeah. So if you're going to create a moral margin in your life, you need to not flirt with it, but you need to flee with it. So here's a question, and we're just going to get very practical for a moment here. What does this look like? What do we do here? And so for a moment, I'm going to talk to teens, and for a moment, there's a couple teens here, and there's some teens online that are watching too, and for singles, married, all of us together. Some of the things can be applicable, and I get it already that you're going to say the same thing that I probably would have said if I was in your position years ago. So what does it look like? The first thing I want to say is teens and others, you need to pre-decide how far you're going to go sexually. Now, what I mean by that is, are you going to let the culture set your limits, or the person that you're dating push you to other limits? Or are you going to allow the Heavenly Fathers to set your limits for you? Really, we have to come to that position. We have to come to that place that we have to set our limits. Because if you don't set limits, you don't have space between you. If there's no breathing room, eventually you're going to cross that line. I've seen it hundreds of times. But if you set that line a little further back than just sex, when you make a mistake or there's a lapse of judgment, a heated car one night or whatever, you're not going to cross that line. You may have some, you may have some regret. You may have a little bit of, oh shoot, you may have a bad relationship in the end of it, but you're not going to have necessarily the scars and the baggage and the regret that you might carry with you the rest of your life. I mean, I challenge you as young people to set limits. And your limit just can't be, okay, I'm not going to have sex until I'm married. Because there's a lot that can happen between, hi, what's your name, and sex. There's a lot that can happen between that. So I challenge you, don't wait for the decision to happen in the moment. Set that decision early before you get there. Pre-decide what you're going to do, how far you're going to go. And don't allow someone else's lack of limits to push you past yours. And I believe the wisest thing you can do as a teenager is to set your standards so high, so far back from sex, that if you ever find yourself tempted in a tempting situation, and you're tempted to step over the line, your standard, even your own standard line, there's enough space between you. There's enough margin that the consequences will be small. Culture won't tell you that. Culture will say, just do whatever you want. But what culture won't tell you is that there's consequences on the other end of that. And I know it's not popular. I know it's not. But it's something I wish people would have held me to when I was your age. My mom, her sex talk with my brother, I've told you this before, my mom's sex talk with my brother and I was, I had sex twice in high school. Once, twice. My mom had us when she was, had my brother when she was 15, and she had me when she was 17. And she is very thankful for both of us. She likes me more than my brother, and I understand that. Clearly. She loves us like crazy, but I'm not going to lie to you. It was very difficult as a child growing up. She's very thankful for us and very thankful for our lives and very thankful that we're in her life and in her story. And she wouldn't change the fact that she has us. I get it, and it's beautiful and wonderful, but the consequences were still there. We struggled through some time of our lives for a period of time. There was trust issues. There was issues with me trusting. There was issues with me and abandonment and all those other things that no one ever told her then. And society would say, well, just kill it. But even then comes a lot of baggage the culture never tells you. See, we need to set standards. Teenagers, set standards. The standards you will never regret. And I challenge you, if you have a question, if you think, oh, standards, blah, 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 blah. You sound like my dad. I get it. It's probably good. Go to someone you respect. Go to someone you like. Whatever they're doing, I dig it. Go ask them. And they're probably not going to tell you, man, you know what my biggest problem was when I set a high standard. Wow, that's when the problems happened. Man, shoot, I should not have said no, man. Everything went downhill from me when I chose to, no. They're going to say, man, I wish I wouldn't have. Or this, you know what, I was so thankful that because we're so caught in that moment, right? And we're so caught. Oh, she's hot, and this, and oh my goodness, he says he loves me. No. Set some standards. Put some margin between you and that line. For the rest of us, these are going to be, you're going to be like, Mark, this is so impractical. I'm just going to be, I get this is super impractical. I get it. I get this is almost probably impossible for your situation. But I'm going to say, you know what, honestly, this is probably not a bad idea to think about. This is things that I kind of practice in my life, and you're like, oh, Mark, of course you're super spiritual. No. But I would just challenge you, avoid dangerous places. Now, you have to decide what those dangerous places are. You have to decide what that looks like for you. But we all know there are places that we go that are going to lead us into temptation and lead us possibly to the next step and the next step and the next step, right? You're not going to take that step if you don't go there. Like, we get this, right? I'm not gonna explain what that is because you know what that is for you, but you just have to be honest with yourself. And you think, well, every time I go there, that's when the temptation hits a little harder. So what I would tell you is this: don't go there. That's what margin looks like. Well, but Mark, I want to go do this. I get it. Then go with your spouse. Go with your accountability. Then go there. But understand, when you go there, you're allowing that temptation. You're squeezing that margin a little shorter. Mark, I am super strong in my faith. I don't care. Avoid dangerous places. This is another one. Avoid time alone with the wrong people. Avoid time alone with the wrong people. I mean, we have like a staff thing here. So Trina and I are on staff. We don't meet alone. We just don't. I mean, clearly I'm like 1,000 years older than Katrina. But we've just set a standard. We're just not going to meet alone. We meet in a coffee shop, or we meet at my house with my family around. We just don't. I had this really weird thing that we just make a habit that I just don't drive in cars with other girls by myself. We used to drive babysitters home. They would have to sit in the back seat on the passenger side. Set some standards. Avoid places where it's going to allow you, or where something happened and this little conversation happened, and we started talking about this, and all of a sudden we got to this. No, just got to avoid that, because every situation I started with people, every situation I've talked to people about, it often starts there. So I just don't let it go. There's this passage in Psalm chapter 1, and we're seeing you guys come up. It says this: blessed is the one who doesn't walk in the step with the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers. And what he's saying is here is that if you don't want to cross that line, then don't step in the space where it becomes easy to do it. Avoid the wrong places, avoid time alone with the wrong people. Here's another one. Have someone else monitor your computer usage. Well, that's private. Yeah. Have someone else know what you're looking at. Have a standard that you're not going to let your computer be just yours or your phone be just yours. Let the people you care about have access to it. Give them your passwords. Be open that way. For years and years, there was a program that we used to use, but I don't know if they have that program anymore. It's called Covenant Eyes. And basically, every place my computer goes, someone else saw where it was. And I know that seems impractical. I know that's kind of private. I know there's some conversations that come from that. But you know what? It's so important because it takes just one little thing here. We're all about 5 minutes away from kind of ruining everything. But allow someone to have full access. Open hands. With your kids. Know what they're looking at. Don't spy on your husband or your spouse. But just you willingly say, hey, here's my stuff. You have the freedom to look at everything that I see. Imagine what that'll do in your family. You're not trying to hide things. Let some people see your social media. Another one is simple, but yet difficult. Just watch something else. It's that simple. Turn the channel to something else. There's some things, man. Again, I love TV. I love movies, and yes, and maybe standards or who. I'm not telling you what standard to have, but when you, just watch something else. Read something different. And my other challenge is just look the other way. You see someone walking down the road or will seem like that, and you're instantly thinking something, just look somewhere else. Just look the other way. I know some of these things seem super simple and like, oh, what's that going to do? But if you practice these in your lives, then what you're doing is you're putting margin between you and temptation. Finally, at the end, this is what we all need to do, and this is where life groups fit in place. This is where one-on-one relationships and conversations have some accountability. Have people in your life who ask you the hard questions where you can't lie to you. You say, you know what, this is where I'm struggling. Help me here. And I know this seems a little extreme. I know that, but guess what? I'm okay with the extremeness of this. Because what I'm reminded of is that anybody can step over the line. Over the past 2 years, some of the people that I have respected the most within pastoral ministry, some of the greatest communicators and some of the greatest speakers and leaders in the Christian community that I know have fallen morally. See, margin is so important because no one plans to ruin their lives. No one does. I don't know anyone who says, you know what, my 5-year plan is to have an affair. I'm building my plan. My 5-year plan is to do this. No one says that. No one we know says, I plan one day, man, my hope is to be addicted to pornography. Like I want to allow what's on the screen to kind of rule my life and rule my relationships and rule my life with my wife and my family or whatever. I want that I want to bring those images and those expectations into my relationship. I want that. That's going to be awesome. Like no one says, if I play my cards right, I can fall into some kind of sexual deal. Maybe it'll cost me my job or my marriage. Maybe I can lose respect. Maybe if I play my cards right, I can lose my respect with my kids. I don't know anyone who thinks like that. yet it still happens all the time, doesn't it? Again, I know this is impractical, and I know we're going long. This is super, super important for us to talk about. But the reality is my wife and my ministry and my children and my testimony, it's worth it. The Bible says, flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a man or woman commits are outside the body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. And then just for those of us who maybe haven't made the wisest choices in the past. Maybe we're not making the wisest choices now. I mean, I don't know your story. I just know mine. I'm going to tell you something really cool. God doesn't turn his back on you no matter what you do. Because all sin separates us from God. God's like, no, I love you. Come to me. And he forgives, and he cleanses, and he reconciles, and he redeems. And he says, hey, man, I know your past, but I died for your past. Let me help you with your future. Family of God, we need to not adopt the standards that our culture pushes us to. But we need to step back from the line and allow us to create margin morally and allow ourselves to be limited by the limits that God leads us to. We need to stop flirting with temptation, but instead flee from it. And in the end, it'll be a life that you don't regret. Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for this opportunity for us to talk and to share and to work through some of these things together. Father, I know this has been a difficult and a challenging conversation, and I know that there's going to be some questions in the end, and that's good. But Father, I pray that you protect our teens. Father, I pray you protect our relationships and protect our marriages. That you'd help all of us to know where the line is and step back even a little bit further. Because you have something more for us than the culture promises. Thank you, God, for your word, and thank you for that it steps on our toes. Thank you that it steps on our toes. But you do it because you love us. We thank you for this day that you've given to us, and that you have a hope and a future for us, no matter where we are, no matter what choices that we've made. You love us.